Hello, hello, testing. Good God. Is that only just now working? I have been speaking for 10 minutes. Unbelievable. I am so sorry about that. That is so strange. Alright, well... Oh, good lord. So I've been talking about Lovecraft now for 10 minutes, and apparently I've offended some elder god because my microphone just was not working, but it wasn't telling me that it wasn't working. Wow. That is special. We are now 26 minutes in. I have been talking for 10 minutes. Amazing. Alright, well, welcome to the stream then, since you didn't hear me the first time. We are talking about 10 minutes, yeah indeed. We are talking about Lovecraft tonight. By way of explanation, I should go through the list of things I was supposed to cover again. The reason why the stream was changed, the timing of the stream was changed from last night, was because Jama Bayorn, who many of you may recognize as the periodic co-host of this channel, managed, while cleaning his bathroom, to break his foot quite badly. So, unfortunately, yesterday was taken up by a rather long evening at the hospital. So obviously that wasn't going to go down then. But we are going to attempt it tonight. Now for the third time, because again, apparently my microphone just wasn't working for the first half hour of this stream. So, yeah. So we're talking about Lovecraft. So the way this is going to go is I'm just going to give some brief thoughts on Lovecraft myself before we go into a couple of videos that I have not seen in some time by H. Bomber Guy and our good old friend the Distributist, respectively. Respond to them as they progress, and then we'll take questions and chat about it after that. But, to begin with, okay, so we're talking about Lovecraft. What does it mean to talk about Lovecraft? Obviously, we're talking about his fiction, or Lovecraftian fiction. Lovecraft, of course, is more than just the single author or his writings. When we talk about Lovecraft or Lovecraftian, we think of an entire category of story or of aesthetic. Specific kinds of things happen in a quote-unquote Lovecraftian story. Specific kinds of things appear. They are sold in a particular way. This is a little bit strange because I've just been talking about this spontaneously and now I'm retreating it. Okay, so what does it mean for a story to be Lovecraftian in the first place? Well, you know what? Screw it. I'm completely discombobulated by having to restart, so we're just going to get right into the videos, and then I think I'll chat after that. I think I've exhausted my ability to spontaneously speak without any prompt. So, we are on a roll today, aren't we? Okay, so the first thing we're looking at, the very first thing we're looking at is, of course, H. Bomber Guy's video, Outsiders, How to Adapt Lovecraft in the 21st Century. And we're just going to watch this and chat about it. I hope that's all right. Without further ado, let's get into it. Is that too quiet? Can everybody hear that? A monologue. Oh, don't worry, you'll get a monologue later.
This is Cthulhu. It's a film that came out in 2008. Not many people appear to have seen it. As a teenager, I was obsessed with the works of Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Lovecraft was a pioneer in pulp horror fiction, immediately gripping with his cavalcade of creative monsters, epic scope, terrible fates, and a unique philosophy about the terror of the existence of gods greater than the human consciousness could allow. The man's work was inspirational and moving to me. It made me think, made me dream, made me want to be a writer. Also, seeing cool new words like theosophists, or non-Euclidean, or sentences like the bloodroots grew insolent in their chromatic perversion, made me feel smart. I liked thinking I was smart. I was a big fan of the role-playing game too. I just really liked the way that it dealt with the mythos and how you interact with it, and the way it modeled sanity was really good too. And hang on, can someone find out who did this and why? I've been confused by this for like a decade now. As my interest grew and I ran out of stories by, inspired by, or about Lovecraft to read, I started playing or watching any game or film even remotely based on his work. I'd seen Reanimator and its sequels, and From Beyond, and I was even about to watch Hellraiser when I found an interview with Clive Barker where he said he didn't like Lovecraft's writing very much and decided not to watch the film out of some misguided sense of spite.
That was how I did things back then. Apparently.
I'd heard that Guillermo del Toro was going to adapt At the Mountains of Madness, one of the best of Lovecraft's stories, and I couldn't wait for that. It turned out I shouldn't have waited because it didn't happen. It was in development hell for a very long time and then it was never greenlit. Then, as I was scraping the bottom of the barrel and watching fan films on YouTube, I eventually found out about Cthulhu. It was named after Lovecraft's most famous creation, and it had been made so recently that it might have been able to take advantage of the kinds of effects and production techniques possible in modern filmmaking that something of truly epic scale might actually have been possible. Cthulhu is not that film. Cthulhu isn't in the film. It isn't even based on the short story The Call of Cthulhu. It's actually a loose, very loose, interpretation of The Shadow over Innsmouth. In that story, the narrator investigates a New England fishing town where the people are strange and unwelcoming to outsiders. He eventually discovers that the people of the town worship a godlike fish creature named Dagon and its monstrous children, and have begun breeding with those creatures. And their descendants eventually transform into monsters themselves to take to the water and live forever beneath the sea with Dagon. After barely escaping with his life, the narrator realizes that his family tree comes from Innsmouth, and he is slowly becoming one of them too, and he's starting to like it, and relish the chance to worship Dagon for all time. It's a really good story, and it's an excellent example of early 20th century American horror, with the narrator's final change serving as a genuinely uncomfortable and fascinating twist. It's really a true classic. This film is about a gay college professor called Russell, who learns that his mother has passed away and returns to his hometown for her funeral. Russell's father is the leader of a strange religious cult, and also deeply homophobic, along with many of the rest of the townspeople. Russell realizes the cult has designs on him of some kind, and something strange is going on. He reconnects with an old lover from his past and tries to learn the truth as the people become increasingly hostile towards his search. In lieu of looking at the tangible specifics of the horror, the beliefs of the cult, or portraying the monsters from the original story, the film focuses on Russell's own emotional state, his experiences and dreams, and relation to the people he encounters as he tries to understand what is happening. When monsters do briefly appear, there's not really much to see. The story isn't really concerned with them. When I first saw this film, I decided that I hated it more than any other film. It had taken something I cared about and enjoyed and removed the things I thought made it interesting and valuable. It made an existential horror about godlike creatures that care not for human affairs into a story where the god in question never turns up or does anything or is even really talked about in it. And even the name's technically the wrong name of the god. Oh, and if you put the disc in a PC, the label doesn't even spell Cthulhu properly. It's such an easy word to spell. The whole film felt like a betrayal. The camera sometimes sits very still, trapping you with Russell in situations neither of you want to be in, for conversations he doesn't want to be having with people he doesn't want to see.
So, how's the church?
How's the gay life treating you, Russell?
It's my life.
So this right off the bat, I actually haven't seen this film. I'm a little bit curious about it. I mean, the camera work's obviously awful. I can't say anything about the actual writing, having not seen the film. But this, of course, is a very un-Lovecraftian scene. I actually can't think of an example of a Lovecraft story where a family dinner takes place or anything of the sort. Lovecraft is... Like, let's take, for example, The Shadow over Innsmouth. The lead character is a student, if memory serves, who is going on a solo sort of tour of the countryside. And he's sort of following, I believe he's following like his own genealogical history. Or let's take The Shadow Out, not The Shadow Out of Time. Dreams of the Witch House, I think is what it's called, yes. You're dealing with a metaphysician / mathematician, philosopher, physicist, something, who is becoming isolatory and neurotic, and is sort of taking his obsessive study of some esoteric thing to an extremely unhealthy unhealthy length. Lovecraftian stories are inherently unsocial. They often deal with social issues, but at a distance. The protagonist is always alone. Even when he talks to people, it's very alone. And the narration sort of emphasizes this. Everybody that a character speaks to is at a great distance. He is sizing them up in terms of their entire history and biography, and he is looking at every single person he encounters as sort of a book, as a biography, something that's already sort of been opened and closed. You never see anything to do with domestic private life, except in the case of The Color Out of Space, in which, of course, the principal victims of the alien element that has intruded onto the heath, I think, where the meteor has landed, is a family of farmers, I believe, or a family that lives on farmland in any case. There are two critical elements to any Lovecraft story. One is the separation of the protagonist from the rest of mankind. A Lovecraftian protagonist is alone. He is either... I think it is always a he. He is either, in some sense, mentally distinct from the people around him, or he has been isolated due to addictive tendencies, or due to an obsession. These are stories essentially about, well, they're sort of stories about what, I guess, a philosopher or a scientist looks, or what one who is not a philosopher or a scientist imagines a philosopher or a scientist to be like. Although that's not all the time untrue. And then this sort of distancing from the rest of the human experience, from the rest of humanity generally, makes him significantly more sensitive to that which is without. A Lovecraftian protagonist always experiences mankind on the one hand, the human world on the one hand, and the other in equal measure with each other, as either equals, or in this case with the alien being able to outweigh it. So much so that the protagonist's perspective doesn't actually change, even when the protagonist himself changes radically, as in the case of The Shadow over Innsmouth. The style of the narration doesn't change as the protagonist slowly becomes a deep one. He simply narrates his journey to the city of Rilya under the sea, in the same way as he narrated his journey into the very human town of Innsmouth. So I can see right off the bat why this film in particular would have annoyed a lot of people. It annoys me, because even just in terms of its style, it misses the point. A film that gets, well, I wouldn't say it gets Lovecraft right, but a film that takes far more part in the Lovecraftian, so to speak, while still involving a social relationship, is The Lighthouse. Specifically because, again, it gives the protagonists sufficient distance from the rest of humanity that they don't have the security of the rest of humanity. Their interactions are not embedded in any sort of external social scaffolding. It's just, they're lost amidst chaos, and so they can see these kinds of more stable environments sort of from the outside. Anyways, let's let him continue a little bit.
Is it satisfying? Are you fulfilled?
What do you want to know? You want to know what we do?
Well, Dad
Danny,
just
please,
wants
just
to
stay
know.
out of this.
I didn't want any of this. I wanted something big, something epic, something focusing on the horror of the big monsters, the sheer scope of the cosmos beyond our reach, and the nihilistic implications of being unimportant in the face of seemingly all-powerful things that can decide our fate on a whim. For so much of it, it was such an uncomfortable and personal and low-key horror. A human horror I wasn't really prepared for and was sure I didn't want. But as I got older and lived a decade of new experiences, to put it simply, I grew up. I just sort of realized one day that I was capable of being romantically attracted to men as well as women. I realized I was different from how I'd even thought of myself. I'd just sort of naturally seen myself as straight. And even if I didn't think I thought of it this way, on some primal level, I'd thought of being straight as being normal. I didn't know why I thought like that. It's probably a mix of not really thinking too hard about these things at the time, combined with the vague notions and expectations our society tends to have towards people's sexuality. But one day I looked in the mirror and saw myself as not who I thought I was. I saw myself as an outsider from me, from the identity I'd assumed for myself. And then I had a few difficult conversations with troublesome people about those feelings. I'd always experienced homophobia. I was an effeminate boy growing up, but I hadn't really cared, because at the time I'd not really accepted it as an insult, or seen anything wrong with being called gay by losers in high school who had just as much growing up to do as I did. But when I actually was one of those people and knew it, all of a sudden it was a real judgment of who I actually was. To them, I'd actually become lesser. Being told I was going to die of AIDS and that my feelings were unnatural and so on, and having to deal with being actually expected to try to convince people that I wasn't inferior to them, suddenly made me think about that Cthulhu film I'd seen a few years before. It was like it knew what I was going through. It knew how it felt to sit in a room you just can't leave and have a piece of your personhood interrogated. It knew how it felt to be seen as an outsider, and it knew how it felt to connect with someone who understands and accepts you. Somehow, it knew me and how I'd felt before I'd ever had a chance to. Some of the scenes from this film just kept coming back up in my mind. It hadn't been what I'd thought I'd wanted, but what it was struck a chord with me anyway, on a level I didn't know was there. It just took a while for me to hear the chiming. It turns out that some of the greatest horrors, biggest sources of sadness in our lives, don't come from scope or big questions, but from the tiniest things. If you've ever lost a loved one and had to be involved with the arrangements of their funeral, or if you've ever had to be around someone you'd made an effort to cut out of your life because of something abusive they'd done to you, or even something as simple as being reminded, gently, that you're in a place where everyone regards you with suspicion, that you're an outsider to them, you will already know that the idea of a powerful cosmic monster out there somewhere beneath the sea can actually be the least of a person's problems. The film was, in retrospect, a meaningful and valuable work that paid respect to the source material's themes and emotions in ways I hadn't grasped as a cynical kid who thought he knew he was straight and thought he knew what made Lovecraft good. And I just wasn't ready to appreciate the value of that kind of story at the time. Here's a review from back in 2009 on the film's Amazon page by someone called Giles. Giles writes,
I can't stress how bad this.
That name's pronounced Gilles, by the way. So, let's get this off this screen. That's annoying me. Yeah, that's better. So he's gestured at something rather interesting. So he's talked about, he says, well, when you actually look at the horror and sadness of human existence, there are things that happen in everyday human life that we would find much worse than the existence of some but the existence of godlike powers or of beings that sort of supersede the protagonist stance, if you will, of humanity and cosmic history. It would be much easier to face the existence of Cthulhu, say, than the existence of your most cherished loved one. Sorry, not the existence of, than the end of the existence of your most cherished loved one. I hope that you are able to stand the existence of your most cherished loved one. But I think this rather misses the point. Because the horror of Lovecraft isn't that the great beings are so terrible. They are. But rather that there is actually no place, or no fixed place for humanity in a world in which beings such as these are in fact the protagonists, or in a world in which there are no protagonists. Because, of course, we are entirely blind to the possibility that Cthulhu is, and in fact, in cosmic terms, one of the smaller fish. Or if indeed that's even an appropriate way to think of things past that scale. And this is one of the reasons why Lovecraft has appeal, because despite the fact that he bills his stories, or his stories have been billed, as being a kind of terror, a terror of the unknowable and the unthinkable, really, Lovecraft stories are actually kind of trite and cozy a lot of the time. We read them and watch them and play them to escape. And why? Well, despite the fact that, supposedly, the Elder Gods, or the Great Ones, or the subterranean enemy races of humanity under the sea and under the ground, from space, what have you, despite the fact that these are all treated as things that are totally alien and unknowable, of course, Lovecraft was writing fiction for an audience, and he was writing stories that we would enjoy, that we would find fascinating. And so when you think of the great race of Yith, or the Deep Ones, or Cthulhu, or Yog-Sothoth, or a Shuggoth, what you're thinking of is a thing that is easily imagined by a human being as, well, as just a sort of a chimera of the fancy. So wouldn't it be so horrible if a human being had these elements mixed in of a fish, or if an organism could exist without any solid form, and additionally it predates on other things, so you are now, once you are caught by this creature, now pressed cheek to cheek with this thing that every part of your brain tells you should be treated with revulsion. These have a one-to-one relationship with our own expectations and fears. They are the polar opposites of the things that we want. They are the polar opposites of the things that we respect in the world. They are the polar opposites of the things in the world that oppress us. There is therapeutic value in thinking about the existence of these things. Because just as, just as the existence of an evil cosmic deity-like being like Cthulhu would be certainly less of a raw source of pain than the death of a loved one, conceiving of this thing is also a way to escape the oppressive banality of everyday life, or the banal oppressions of everyday life. You can think to yourself when you are being belittled at work, or when you are having an argument that you've lost and you've been made to look like a fool, that, well, it ultimately doesn't matter, because the number of humankind is finite, its duration will be finite, and there are greater things that will not judge me in the same way that will supersede them. So, yours is empty, vain tongue of the damned, so to speak. This is all very cathartic. True horror would be, well, true horror, a thing that we would actually feel horror towards and not simply fascination, because I think I think when people think of Lovecraft as horror, they mistake horror with fascination. We are fascinated by Lovecraft's monsters. We want to know more about them. People spend hundreds and hundreds of hours of their lives reading about them, writing about them, expanding on the mythos, because the fact is we aren't really reviled by these things. We aren't. Is it revolted? We don't feel revulsion towards these things. Not really. We feel absolute fascination. What we feel revulsion towards is really the non-existence of such fascinating things in the world, of principles that are absolutely banal, of the idea not of the cosmos as being this dark, mysterious sea filled with monsters, but as this kind of beige wall, right? The picture of an iron cage, the universe as an iron cage, the world as an iron cage, as this closed system of rules that will never be broken, whose effects are always disappointing. That is so much worse than the existence of a huge diversity of different kinds of reality and different kinds of being and different kinds of world and different treasures and kinds of knowledge to discover. Lovecraft is fantasy. We love to read Lovecraftian stories. They make us feel happy. It's edgier Star Trek in a way. And I think that's really, to get back to the point I was sort of stuttering through after we solved the mic issue at the beginning of this stream, that is really the key to understanding what the Lovecraftian refers to. Because the elements of Lovecraft stories, in terms of like the things that happen or the things that exist in them, or the kinds of mysteries that unfold, or even the kinds of fates that the protagonists meet, these are not unique to Lovecraft at all. These are elements that we can find in sources as diverse as, Solaris by Stanislaw Lem, a Polish science fiction writer. We find it in, I don't actually know, I can't pronounce the names for the life of me, but the authors of Roadside Picnic, which was the inspiration for the film Stalker, which is also an interesting movie but a terrible rendition of the book, or Metro 233. Like, I think that's a worse example. I think Metro actually sort of falls into the Lovecraftian realm. But how about H.G. Wells? I mentioned that earlier. These all have exactly the same elements that I've described. Things that actually I'm gonna go back on that. Do I want to include H.G. Wells here? Yeah, we'll include H.G. Wells here. So like alien races that predate humanity and displace its significance, its vain conception of its own significance in the cosmos. We are the only kind, and we are the only of our kind, and we are the greatest of our kind. And we judge the advancements of aliens in other places relative to our current advancements, or relative to the advancements we fantasize about having in the future. Solaris, of course, is about the study of a sentient sea on a planet that starts to manifest apparitions of the dead loved ones of the crew of the vessel that is studying it. It's this great unknowable consciousness in space. But ultimately it doesn't appear to be hostile. It seems neither indifferent nor attentive. It just sort of does things that are inscrutable to our tiny human minds. And of course, Stalker has to do with not Stalker, but Roadside Picnic. The very title indicates something, what we would tend to assume is quintessentially Lovecraftian. The idea of aliens stopping at Earth at some point in history or recently, doing something that we can't understand, then leaving, sort of like how a trucker, say, stops on the side of the road, eats their lunch, throws their wrapper on the ground, and then the ants come out and collect the pieces. Well, same with us. The stalkers go into the zone where the alien forces have some sort of lingering influence. Not a conscious influence. This is just the detritus of their coming and going. And we collect their garbage or their leavings as if it was like the most valuable treasure, which to us it is, horrifically. These are elements that are in all sorts of stories. Hell, Moby Dick can almost be conceived in Lovecraftian terms. A recent film that's very good that I recommend, The Lighthouse. I think I just mentioned that in the last little bit. All have elements that we associate with Lovecraft, but ultimately, what sets Lovecraft apart is that there is a fixation on the aesthetic of this overcoming of something else. It's not an indifference. This thing is hostile to us, and it has a specific invalidating, cathartically invalidating relationship with the human. All of our problems are indeed nothing, because there is something greater that regards it as nothing. If you're somebody of ambition and somebody who's successful, that can be a terrible thing. But if you're a loner, if you're somebody who's ultimately only really interested in sort of digging into the dark places in the world, whether through psychology or through philosophy or physics, what have you, that can be very liberating. And so I think what makes the Lovecraftian is indeed that specific relationship, that very human relationship with this quote-unquote unknown, disregarding the fact that even to call it unknowable is to say that we definitively know of it in some respect. Let's keep going.
Straight and thought he knew what made Lovecraft good, and I just wasn't ready to appreciate the value of that kind of story at the time. Here's a review from back in 2009 on the film's Amazon page by someone called Giles. Giles writes,
I can't stress how bad this film is on every level. As for H.P. Lovecraft, he must be spinning in his grave, because this is definitely the worst film adaptation yet. It is vaguely based on Shadow over Innsmouth, but the story, what there is of it, is so badly constructed that you could easily miss the very few similarities.
And why all the gay subplot? What was that all about?
Now, here's the thing about Giles from 2009. I was Giles
Gilles.
in 2009. No, I'm fairly certain I didn't write this exact Amazon review, but I felt the same way as this person at around the same time. It didn't make sense to the teenage me whose main frame of reference on the world was the horror stories he'd read. But then I grew up and it started making a lot more sense without me even having to go back and see the film again.
Okay, so just a quick note. I think complaining about the gay subplot is rather silly. I think making it the focus of the story kind of misses the point. Because, again, even in a society in which being homosexual is, or having homosexual relationships, or being bisexual or what have you, let's just say being sexually or identitarily divergent from quote-unquote the norm in any way, shape, or form results in a lot of friction and isolation within a community. One is still a part of a community and can find a place either within sort of a counterculture or a sub-community or what have you, or against the rest of that community, or embedded in hiding within the main line of the community against, that is prejudiced towards the things that one is. Lovecraft stories aren't really about that. They're about a situation in which the human entire is invalidated. Not the identity of one within humanity. One doesn't find their place in a Lovecraft story. One finds that one has no place in a Lovecraft story.
This film and its delayed effect on me got me thinking about what works about Lovecraft stories, what doesn't, and what the best way might be to navigate these qualities in creating an adaptation. And along the way, with a lot of encouragement, and if it's not too awkward, We'll maybe talk about the fact that a writer who basically founded a subgenre of fiction, has been hugely influential and made so many people want to become writers, including myself, was really massively racist. Anyway, let's start at the beginning, shall we? Why do humans create and tell each other stories? Yeah, I'm sure we can settle that real quick. We've only been asking that question for a millennia. I can solve that. I've got a plaque for surpassing over 100,000 YouTube subscribers.
Firstly, we should acknowledge that fiction isn't simply the opposite of truth. It is, in some sense, a reflection of truth. Let's look at horror stories. When a ghost story speaks of a place being haunted by the past, it speaks to us about the ways that really does happen, the ways the world controls and decides things for us, and how the legacy, the result of other people's decisions are still here with us, even after the people who made them are gone. The ghosts of the past really do haunt the present they built. Vampires, similarly, tend to be impactful because they reflect some true aspect of the society that was writing about them at the time. There's a reason Dracula was a count. Vampires are aristocratic, upper-class beings that live by parasitically consuming the essence of the poor workers and exploiting people using their influence, either their literal riches or their other, less tangible powers. And in doing this, they literalize a very real but much more vague social antagonism. The aristocracies, monarchies, and other rich and powerful figures over history rarely actually drink people's blood for sustenance, although the way the current economy is going, who knows, but the rich really are vampires, in a sense. They really do profit and thrive from the work and sacrifice of those beneath them.
I think this sort of misreads the nature of vampire stories, like from Stoker onwards. I'm not too familiar with the history myself, but I have a suspicion that the reason why Dracula was a count is because being a count allows him to be distant and isolatory, and that gives him mystique and also makes him other. It makes him a kind of thing that can be thought of as something outside of a society, preying upon the society as another to that, as opposed to, say, a criminal or a serial killer. So basically, actually, I think and I mean, yeah, as if to illustrate, this kind of story long predates the idea of not the idea, but like sort of modern vampire type story. Like think of Grendel from Beowulf, who is very much of the same type. The only difference is that rather than occupying a place of high rank, he occupies a dragon cave somewhere. But again, I think the critical element there is not so much the social status, but the fact that social status affords, plausibly, Dracula's isolation and his capacity to satisfy his needs without physically skulking about in towns at night.
It's not unimaginable that consciousness of this kind of antagonism makes its way into folklore as creatures that are only slightly more exaggerated forms of the actual power relationships between rich and poor people, or boss and worker.
Bram Stoker, more like Gramsci Stoker. Doesn't really work, does it? Is there a better Marxist thinker who would work here as a pun? Let me know in the comments so I can feel like an idiot for missing it.
When you're reading Dracula, you're not just reading a creative horror about a scary monster, you're reading a story that most people, on some level, understand. It's relevant to the world people live in, where a non-magical version of Dracula's immense influence and theft of livelihood from ordinary people really does happen. Notably, even Karl Marx repeatedly used vampirism as a way of describing the nature of capitalism in Das Kapital.
Look, my point...
Yeah, but again, like, that's by way of demonizing the people he was critiquing. Aptly, as it happens. But he wasn't reflecting the fact that people view them, or that he even viewed them as vampires, but that they can be likened to vampires. And notice that the relationship is reversed. The vampire didn't emerge as an obvious allegory for the rich. The rich evolved to match the allegory of the vampire.
Point here isn't that vampire stories are all secretly about how capitalism is bad or something. That would be ridiculous, and so many of them were written before the actual proper invention of capitalism as we know it today. My point is that It was a way of talking about issues that functioned so well that when the time came to actually talk about things like capitalism, the guy who started talking about it used vampires as a way of talking about it, which usually means that the stories were onto something that was kind of like real, something that was there.
Yeah, so he's sort of reversing his thesis here, and he's saying more or less what I just said. That's a bit annoying, but at least he caught it.
It's also notable that 50 Shades of Grey, originally a fanfiction based on Twilight, kinda does this too. It takes out all the major supernatural aspects of Twilight, and of course the simplest way of bringing the dynamics between a magical, immortal vampire and a young, innocent teenage girl into the real world is to reimagine the vampire as a billionaire with immense influence and a very particular sexual taste.
Look, the richer vampires, basically. I think I've made this point.
The slasher film also embodies this as well. The killer in slasher stories is an urban, modern creature which expresses modern urban fears. The fear of what's happening in the neighborhood behind everyone's closed doors, where they could be getting up to just about anything. The fear of the effects of modern living on people growing up in it. Fellow YouTuber Nick Spheres did a really cool video going into the deeper aspects of this in Halloween, which you can check out linked in the description. It's good and long and fun, and please go watch it. The slasher films are silly, gross, gory, and often just kind of bad, but they got popular because they're dealing with something that's real and actually happening.
No, I think they got popular because people like watching people's heads get lopped off. Sorry to say.
Okay, that's not actually happening in real life. But that's from like part 8 of a franchise, and you don't get 7 sequels without at least originally having some resonating cultural... he punches his head into a bin. You get a perspective shot of it, it's like you're looking out of his head as it flies off. The idea that fiction is not the opposite of facts, but actually can be more truthful than facts on their own, is key to what makes storytelling so important. Art is all lies, all perceptions, always subjective, always up for further interpretation, and always slanted by the perspectives of its creators. But art is lies in service to truth. Bringing all of this back, what of Lovecraft? What makes his work in particular continue to be remembered alongside Dracula or Halloween and act as direct inspiration for yet more?
I just want to say quickly before we continue that I find the sentence that art is lies in service to truth. It hurts me internally. As a political scientist and someone with some modest philosophical capacities, it's like, good God.
More creative works. What truth is hidden within his fiction? Well, it might be the existential horror. His works come together to relate a thoroughly nihilistic universe, wholly uncaring about our existence, and there may well be a truth to that, but it isn't whether or not human existence actually matters that's central to his work. It's not quite the idea of that stuff actually being true, but rather the direct feeling of being unimportant in the...
Exactly, but that's not the horror. Sorry, that is the horror, but that's the horror of this world. That's not the horror of Lovecraft's fiction. Lovecraft's fiction is suffuse with meanings. They're simply not human meanings. And in fact, they're meanings that have a therapeutic value for many of us because they tell us that a lot of our problems are actually, from the cosmic perspective, not really that important, and that our oppressors, no matter how much they aggrandize themselves, whether it's the abusive parent, the abusive boss, the oppressive system that doesn't allow you to really get a leg up financially, materially, or socially, what have you, or even just to live in quiet and freedom, that these things are ultimately, for all of their bluster and all of their gloating, tiny and insignificant themselves. And so at the very least, you have the dignity of knowing your situation.
The grand scheme of things. Lovecraft's writing and tropes function in this regard a lot like one of the writers who in turn inspired him, Edgar Allan Poe. Poe doesn't exactly make people feel good. Rather, he makes them feel sad in a productive way. It can make people who are prone to those feelings feel less alone, because they know others have them too. The Call of Cthulhu doesn't begin by telling you how scary a big monster could be, or giving you a description of what its tentacles would look like. It opens with a profound fear of the future, and of what discoveries might lie there.
The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age.
Cool.
So what mattered wasn't how creative or imaginative his stories got, but how they related to people's own feelings of unimportance then and now in the actual world. There's the old joke that a paranoid person, if they were ever to discover the room that the government spied on them from with all the notes on their lives, they wouldn't actually be any more afraid because of this. They'd feel validated. They weren't paranoid, they were right. And through that lens, Lovecraft is a way of feeling completely assured that the world really is out to get you. And maybe God doesn't care or hates you or wants you dead.
You can use special effects to design something scarier than the man himself could ever have imagined, but that alone isn't actually the thing that's scary about the story. What's scary is the way these smaller aspects build to create a sense that humans are tiny and powerless creatures, that the greatest height we can aspire to is a deep and intimate understanding of just how little we understand.
Lovecraft rarely reused his creations between stories, and that's because the creatures he came up with didn't really matter. They were interchangeable, and the ideas they existed to communicate with their scope and alienness was what mattered.
Unfortunately, however, this is where things get a bit hairy and complicated. One of Lovecraft's most famous quotes goes, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." And you know what this guy didn't know much about? People of other races.
Look, we've managed to brush past it, but we do have to talk about Lovecraft's racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and homophobia. It's happening now.
So for the folks out there who don't think you can criticize an author's beliefs just because it was a different time and it happened 100 years ago, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time. I promise I'll review a game and make some jokes or something in the next one. Are they gone? Okay, they're gone. Right, so it's pop culturally quite well known that Lovecraft was a bit xenophobic, and I do remember reading some pretty bad stuff, but it was a while ago that I read it, and I'm sure it can't be as bad as I remember.
What the fuck is nautical looking supposed to mean, Howard? What does it even mean?
In his biography,
I've been talking with the mic off again. Good God. Okay, so here's just to reiterate what I was just saying. I need to figure this stuff out. This is disastrous. Oh my God. Right. So here's a good quote for you. I think actually one of the sources of Lovecraft's appeal is the racism inherent in his stories. By that I do not mean, to be clear, his disparaging attitude towards non-white people, the unfortunate name of his cat, his xenophobia, what have you. Rather, I think specifically of how he conceives of the human in strictly racial terms, and conceives of the other in specifically racial terms. And this is one of the things that makes the alien other so fascinating and similar, like so palatable. When we think of a deep one, let's say in Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innsmouth, there are no characters that are deep ones in The Shadow over Innsmouth. The deep one is simply a kind. The description of a single deep one in terms of its physical form is in fact the description of all deep ones in the context of a Lovecraftian story, because it becomes so alien, apparently, that to even talk about motive and personality in any particular sense becomes meaningless. But really, it's not, because the deep ones have a very human goal. They want to conquer the surface of the globe. They want to aggrandize themselves. They want to secure riches and the means to reproduction. They are themselves human beings that have been mutated into a fish-like form. They even their shape, the two arms on their shoulders and the two legs at their pelvis, walking upright, like this is a mammalian shape. I guess that's sort of begging the question, because I think that the definition of shoulders is sort of the place where your arms meet your neck. But in any case, part of the aesthetic charm is specifically that way of distinguishing the other in terms of an amorphous blob, where the kind becomes the individual, which is actually sort of nonsensical when you think about it. If we're talking about a species that is comprised of rational individuals, it doesn't actually make sense to talk about a single motive. There can be a single sort of dominating motive. There could be the religion or the high priests of the deep ones who determine what the collective ultimately does, but they will all have thoughts, they will all have lives, they'll all have their own independent goals. They're just simply made completely inscrutable by their depiction as being other by dint of specifically their descent. And that's sort of part of the interest of Lovecraft, because he hits a sort of historical note where what starts to get centered isn't so much the individual human experience, but its place in a long historical trajectory. And of course, by Lovecraft's time, we start to think of races in that way. Inappropriately, it often is the case. But so many people start to think of human beings in evolutionary terms, both at the level of the species and less appropriately within. And we can even think of a way in which that's not an intuitively bad way to think of things. So for example, when we think of like say in the situation of an alien invasion, like let's say in fact you had a bunch of mindless, heartless squid monsters invading Earth, well, it might actually make sense to conceive of them in those terms. For a couple of reasons. First of all, because it gives us the focus and the hatred of the enemy necessary to allow us to survive such a situation. But secondly, because we also lack the capacity, except in terms of referring to their biology and their genealogy, etc., to actually sympathize with these creatures. Maybe. At the very least, like when we think of War of the Worlds, we don't tend to think, what are the feelings or the aspirations of that particular tripod pilot, right? And this seems sort of natural to us. It becomes really problematic when you're talking about people adopting this attitude within the species towards other members of their own kind, people who they could very easily relate to and have a positive relationship, positive social relationship with. And to whom, additionally, they have moral obligations. this is potentially one of the more disturbing aspects of Lovecraft, is that his very, very modern, very racially oriented view of life in general really becomes sort of the centerpiece. Because ultimately what he described, to the extent that he does describe the other, he describes it entirely in biological terms, or in terms of biological descent. And how, in fact, most of his stories start, like, say, The Shadow over Innsmouth, or The Call of Cthulhu especially. The protagonist is engaging in a genealogical investigation into something, into the state of affairs that has... into the history of a disaster that has befallen a town, like in the case of Innsmouth, or of the historical studies of some dead professor or something. The horror is not the horror, I should say. The interest is primarily focused on the realization of a hitherto undisclosed otherness or difference within or invalidating human history. And it does so in almost entirely racial terms, even when it's not dealing with race specifically. Am I muted again? Am I muted right now? Like, can you hear me? Hang on, I'm gonna ask through type. I may have to do this stream again. This is awful. I am so sorry. I am terrible with technology. Yeah, let me know if you can hear me now. That would be fantastic. Okay, good. Okay, so we're good now. So when did I stop being audible? All right, we'll keep going. Oh, good God. What dark, unknowable deity did I anger before this stream?
Biography of H.P. Lovecraft, fittingly entitled Against the World, Against Life, Michel Houellebecq writes,
The character of Lovecraft fascinates us partly because his system of values is entirely opposed to ours. Fundamentally racist, openly reactionary, he glorifies Puritan inhibition and quite evidently finds repellent any open display of eroticism. Resolutely anti-commercial, he despises money, considers democracy to be pure folly, progress an illusion. The word liberty, so dear to Americans, elicits from him only a gloomy sneer. All his life he maintained a typically aristocratic attitude of scorn for humanity in general, together with an extreme solicitude toward individuals in person.
Houellebecq kinda sucks, honestly, and idolizes some of Lovecraft's worst qualities in his biography, but this quote is helpful in illustrating the specifics of Lovecraft's worldview, so I'm gonna use it. A stopped clock is right twice a day, I suppose. Lovecraft seemingly hated society itself, but he had a deeper and specific dislike for black and Jewish people, along with immigrants. It's so prevalent in his writing that even citing multiple examples would kind of diminish how overwhelming and constant it is. I can't even bring myself to say the name of Lovecraft's cat, because it's a racial slur. And despite this obviously completely full schedule of racism and general hatred for humanity itself, he also managed to find time to be a raging homophobe. He claimed not to have even known homosexuality existed until he was in his 30s, but then he goes on to immediately compare it to being a pederast.
You know, growing up, I always would immediately try to find...
As someone who grew up in a setting, just as a brief aside, where being gay was viewed with sort of disgust as sort of a cultural standpoint. When you have, especially when you're a child and you are learning of this at a stage in your life when you are not actually becoming aware of your own sexuality or things like that, and you look at people, even young people, as being your elders. Like, for example, it's always a bit strange when you go to elementary school and your teachers who are in their 20s look so much older. Like they look like, compared to you, they could be middle-aged, but then you reach that age and you realize, like, these people who were the big overlords when I was a child, they're just kids, really. When you're learning about, in the context of a very sexually restrictive and prejudicial culture about these things, you associate those things with the people who are around you. And it being an adult thing, sort of, it being a thing that is of particular interest to people who are either adolescent or adults, you tend to associate it with people who are your caretakers. And so your immediate perception of homosexuality, say, is of, I mean, it's difficult to explain. Your perception of it is, it's an activity that you perceive as taking place amongst guardian figures, and insofar as you conceive of yourself engaging in that way, you conceive of it in relation to that. And I think that's where a lot of inbuilt homophobia comes from. I'm just speculating, but I think a lot of it, and this sort of association with pederasty that you see, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, especially in areas where, perhaps only in areas, I mean, I've got a limited experience, of course, only in cultural sectors where heterosexual relationships are valorized in some way, shape, or form, and homosexual ones don't even really exist except as sort of perhaps as a subject of comedy or curiosity. Sort of in the same way as how trans characters in television and film, until very recently, in the past 15 or so years roughly, I remember in the 90s, it was a stock character of comedy, with the result, of course, that if you knew nothing about this, or if you knew nobody personally who experienced gender dysphoria or was expressed an identity other than what was ascribed to them on their birth certificate, you took that for it just seemed silly because you had no point of reference. And for people who grow up with no point of reference for how sexuality works, and of course, who grow up, I'm specifically referring people who haven't grown up to the point where they have an understanding of how sexuality works, or something like that. And you have these really toxic associations implanted in your psyche at such an early age. That kind of thing can lead to a visceral level of disgust, because you're not thinking of it in terms of consenting adults of the same age. You're thinking of it in terms of, these are older people, older people doing gross older people things, and with a guy, like, you know what I mean? It's like, it's bad, but I think people are sort of cultivated into it. I don't think it's a hatred of the thing itself. I think it has to do with a kind of cultural or educational blindness. Anyways, I'm going to stop meandering about that.
Find ways to write off or hand wave away the racism. You know, I would say, well, it was a product of his time. I never really just sat down and gave myself the opportunity to just say, God, what a piece of shit. I mean, honestly, like, his work meant something to me in a really, like, profound way that no other work has ever really done. But I fucking think the guy's terrible.
As a side note, Lovecraft's views apparently softened a little bit over time. In a letter he wrote a month before his death, he claimed he understood the blindness and defiant ignorance of reactionaries because he used to be one. I know how smugly ignorant I was, he wrote. He supposedly became a socialist in the last year of his life and supported the New Deal, and he was married to a Jewish woman for a while, but it's debatable whether he really developed all that much, and the racism in his work is still unavoidably there.
And this leads us to a very weird and difficult question. Why are there queer Lovecraft fans? Why do I exist? And why do so many people like me exist? Why is this space a place for a lot of queer and marginalized people in the first place? Why does his work resonate so well with people who the man himself would have hated even more than he hated everyone else? Now, I don't think I'm qualified to answer this question. I don't actually think anyone really is. There's probably a lot of different reasons.
Well, I meet the descriptions of everybody he's just talking about, including Lovecraft in his early years, so I'm probably the most qualified person there is to talk about this. I don't think reactionaries generally do actually hate most people. I think sort of that kind of reactionary attitude or that character that these people don, where they have these they put on these supercilious airs, and they'll talk about the folly of democracy because of all of these horrible, stupid people, these horrible, stupid degenerates everywhere. They just want to do whatever they want, and they don't care if society crumbles or if morals decay, etc. I think this is a mode people go into as a cope for powerlessness and having perhaps deeply held convictions that are not necessarily thought out to the level of establishing confidence, the sort of confidence that allows one to stand firm and indifferent when people disagree, but nonetheless still experiencing friction, discomfort with things that are going on, things that are being done in a way that seems callous or irresponsible or even violent, and lacking any useful tools to actually express their issues with it, or even perhaps a developed understanding of what their issues actually are. And so they happen onto these tropes effectively, these tropes that in literature and in history appear to have a kind of contrary power to the attitudes that they see prevailing. And so they'll adopt like a kind of high speak in the most inappropriate times. They'll talk about again, like the folly, the music of the common people, I think, in all seriousness, a reactionary attitude is almost impossible for someone who is motivated purely by hate, because we see the difference. There are right-wingers, for example, and left-wingers too, to be sure, who will spit acid and vitriol, and not vitriol in the sense of bitter or implicitly prejudiced or bigoted language, but in language intended to disgust and shock. The use of slurs not as a term of derision for a category, but as a way to elicit shock in the recipient, or the use of violent sexual language, for example. These people don't adopt the airs of reactionaries for the most part. They're essentially just thugs, and I don't think the average reactionary is that at their core. I think reactionaries, by and large, they're kind of like high school goths in a way, or at least the cliche of the high school goth being a person who puts on an aesthetic as a kind of, and I'm not dissing people who adopt a gothic aesthetic, to be clear. I'm drawing on a cliche as an illustration, and I apologize if anybody resembles these remarks, but this is not directed at you. But they don this aesthetic in both behavior, in the interests that they choose to cultivate, and in terms of their language, as itself a defense. The content is almost immaterial. The point is that they are taking a stance as something that is not the thing that causes them that discomfort in the world, or that even they revolt against on perhaps even a moral level, but not one that they can articulate strongly. those errors are a crucial part of their ability to identify as against this thing that they cannot palate. And so my inclination here is to actually disagree with H. Bomber Guy's assessment of Lovecraft's character. I don't think he was a piece of shit. I mean, in a certain sense, sure he was, but I think by and large, this is a person who, as he said in his own words, grew up blind and probably died blind, like all of us will, in many ways, and did change, and that's crucial too, because when people change, flexibility is the essence of life. People who change with new information and with new experiences aren't motivated by hatred. They're actually allowing themselves to be changed by the world. And if they're changing for the better, I mean, I don't know, it seems a bit strange to condemn a man in his seniority on the grounds of things that he himself says he grew out of and were bad. I mean, we all do this, and we all will do this in the future. There are things that are simply taken for granted now that will be widely assumed to be bad in future. And not because it was sort of inscrutable to our minds, but because we had other issues hogging our attention. And other kinds of things that were causing us pains. Like, I'm not particularly well read on Lovecraft's home situation or the politics with which he was specifically concerned. I largely like his stories, but like we understand the world and its problems, and we are agitated by things going on in distant lands, largely by the representation in the media. All of our experience of the world is mediated, is heavily mediated, and what our attention is drawn to largely governs what we consider as being a morally relevant question or issue, or an issue about which one can develop morally relevant stances. Anyway, all that to say, while I think there's, and again, of course, like, Lovecraft did not suddenly become a saint in his old age, but I think to assume on the grounds that one in their youth held, or more specifically, because we actually don't have access to what these people held in their minds, that one had racist utterances or bigoted utterances or cruel utterances, or made them, I should say, that therefore they were dyed-in-the-wool racists who just desperately wanted nothing but evil and harm to non-whites, non-straights, etc. I think that's an assumption I wouldn't be prepared to sustain, and I think it also creates a very grim situation in which nobody can actually change. It's a little bit funny because, I mean, I think it's a pretty universal criticism of the Christian religion, let's say, that eternal punishment is meted out for finite crimes on earth, assuming for the sake of argument that we assume unproblematically that sins in the context of religion are crimes or wrongs, or actual wrongs, I should say. And yet we have absolutely no problem with condemning people to the dustbin on the grounds of things they did in their youth. And now, I mean, of course, if they refuse to repent of certain bad things, I mean, it's perfectly valid to condemn the person in their old age for those sayings. But you know what? On that note, the word that we translate as hell, I guess we don't really translate it as hell so often, but the Old Testament equivalent of hell, Sheol, was literally a garbage dump. So, anyway.
But from what I can gather, it seems like the answer lies in the specifics of how Lovecraft saw the world, in the place that his approach actually came from.
When Lovecraft was 3 years old, his father had a breakdown and was committed to a mental hospital. He died there 5 years later. His mother also frequently suffered from similar problems and later died in the same hospital. Lovecraft suffered from periods of severe anxiety and depression. He had to drop out of high school and often isolated himself for long periods at a time. He saw himself as a temporary visitor to a strange and unwelcoming world. This is present even in one of Lovecraft's earliest stories, The Outsider. The narrator escapes from being trapped within a decaying castle, but his search for human contact is frustrated when the people he finds run away in horror. He turns and sees a detestable and ghoulish creature has entered the room. To his shock, he realizes he's looking into a mirror.
All of his best works draw into close focus not some generic fear of outsiders, but the anxieties and fears that come with being an outsider, of being in a world that doesn't really understand you, and perhaps of not being fully able to understand yourself.
That's not really the full story, though. So in The Outsider, this protagonist who climbs out of this castle to the surface world out of a graveyard, and enters a dwelling and is treated with terror by the denizens therein, and then sees in the mirror that he is this horrible, ghoulish creature. He then returns back down to the castle, which he now recognizes as his proper home. And what's sort of curious about this is that, again, like, it's a purely racial way of conceiving the human, because his mind is a rational human mind. We even in film today, like we as a trope have characters that resemble horrible, hideous monsters of pulp fiction, dressing up in suits and ties and bowler caps and fedoras and going to work and being the picture of civility. And their appearance doesn't particularly matter. Hellboy's a great example of this, in which the less aesthetically human the person is, the more genteel and cultured they are. So, like, Johann Kraus is this professorial, proper character. Abe is a much more, who's the fishman, ironically enough, is the much more socialized of the two, between him and Hellboy. So what's really fascinating is that that friction between the other and the normal, or the other and the human, stops at the level of surface appearances, despite the obvious counter evidence of the common rationality between them, perhaps even the superior rationality, or the more developed rationality and self-awareness of this outsider, of this ghoulish character who has climbed up out of the depths. This is a person who has an advantage that the family he's encountering doesn't have. He knows about his own rationality and the fact that his very human mind transcends his outward appearance, something that the family is blind to. They can only identify the human by reference to external trappings. And yet, and we also know this as well. Like, for example, we think of sort of the trope of the sociopath. So, for example, the novel American Psycho, wherein you have this character who looks like the picture of humanity. He is a well-dressed, successful, well-socialized, economically and socially embedded ideal man who can nonetheless say of himself, of his internal existence relative to the people around him, I simply am not. He is a ghoul on the inside, and is ultimately, like, he's a way more fearsome creature than this very human character who has the external look of a non-human. I mean, in a way, yeah. Yeah. Let's continue. I lost my train of thought there.
So there is a fairly
I didn't actually lose my train of thought there. I'm just not really sure how to continue that.
decent reason here why someone might be drawn to these works, even if the author was deeply problematic. And this appears to have been true to some degree at the time in a strange way. Lovecraft was pretty open about the problems he had with homosexuality. However, several of his closest friends were gay, including the poets Hart Crane and Samuel Loveman, and Robert Hayward Barlow, who he worked closely with on numerous stories, and who Lovecraft made the executor of his literary estate in the event of his death. It's partially due to Barlow that so much of Lovecraft's writing has been preserved over the years, given how he wasn't all that popular at the time. The deeply bigoted belief in a link between homosexuality and pedophilia is invoked, this time on purpose, in the film as well. There's a scene in Cthulhu where Russell is arrested on manufactured charges of being a pedophile.
You're under arrest for murder? Oh, come on. Rape of a minor? Oh, but you can't... Trespass.
The event is positioned as an extension of his mistreatment by the rest of the town. We're seeing the kind of alienation the original stories had to invent a foreign cult to get across, but translated into actual things people do experience.
Oh yeah, you like this? Faggot goes off to jail?
The easiness and convenience with which having a different sexual preference is equated with criminality is something that real people deal with even today. For some people, the intellectualized existential problems Lovecraft had originally written to explore cease to be theoretical and start to communicate familiar experiences, the same way Edgar Allan Poe's writing can be to someone who's lost a loved one, or the way Halloween explores the suburban fear of one's neighbors, or Dracula puts words to a deeper understanding of the antagonism between different classes in our social hierarchy. For those who've been treated like this in the name of a religion, or simply by their surrounding society because of its horrific expectations, have they not come the closest a person can in the real world to the central Lovecraftian experience? Have they not, in a sense, glimpsed the face of an uncaring universe?
I don't think so. I don't think someone who encounters, say, a callous or prejudiced family member, or an oppressive boss, or an oppressive upperclassman lording it over them, has for that reason encountered an uncaring universe. They have encountered a universe that cares about them in a very undesirable way. Somebody who takes pains to express their disgust at an activity or an identity or a predilection or a sexuality of somebody else doesn't by that expression demonstrate that they are uncaring. They demonstrate that they care about aspects of you in a way that is intolerable to you. They care that you are accommodating to norms, or that you are fitting into molds, or that you are excising from yourself certain needs and wants that are important to them, that you are fulfilling this role that they need to see you fulfill if you are to exist in their world. You need to be productive at a certain level. You need to be fulfilling your social responsibilities as they conceive them. You need to be bearing yourself in a way that they don't find personally disgusting. This isn't an uncaring universe. This is a cruel universe, and that's distinct, because an uncaring universe can be cathartic and can be much more merciful than a caring universe. A caring universe indeed. That would be a horror. H. Bomber Guy isn't trying to dismiss Lovecraft. He's saying that you can't deal with Lovecraft without the context of xenophobia. Yeah, I agree. I actually quite like this video. I don't think H. Bomber Guy is out to lunch here. I'm just sort of offering my own thoughts on this. And I think that H. Bomber Guy is actually fairly on point for the most part here. I'm just sort of expanding on it. I disagree with certain aspects of his analysis, but it's hardly a definitive disagreement. I think he's pretty solid. No, he deserves his views and his subscriber count here. I think he's actually a pretty solid creator. But what was I saying? Yeah, it's not an uncaring universe that Lovecraft describes. It's a universe that cares about us in a specific way that offsets the toxic ways in which the present universe cares about us. Now, that's not made explicit, of course. His protagonists are already outsiders. But it's the universe he describes is one that is a relief to someone who is cared about in this cruel way in the universe that we inhabit now. That's what I think. The scholarship around Lovecraft's work is almost pitiful with regards to understanding his inspiration and the way he cashes that out in the themes that play in his stories. Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think there's sort of there's almost a bit of snobbery around the analysis of Lovecraft. One of the reasons why I really appreciate Slavoj Žižek is that he understands that it's actually important to engage with popular work, and that you shouldn't disparage popular work because it says things that refine sort of scholarly or sort of the works of virtuosity. These don't say. They depict experiences and assumptions and perhaps far more fixed aspects of our reality than these more quote-unquote cultivated sensibilities or products do. And of course, his the wealth of extremely uncouth and today unpalatable quotes that you can mine from Lovecraft make that very easy, and not in an unjustified sense necessarily. But I think that's right. I don't think he is really read seriously. He's treated almost as on a par with the writing of Dungeons and Dragons, right? So, but I think he's actually a very important, maybe not like, it's not like studying the influence of the Bible or of Marx or something, but he's an important touchstone, I think, and he is being ignored unjustly. Not in terms of the merits of his person, but just in terms of the historical significance of his work. I think it's a mistake to ignore it, and the fact that it is appealing.
He was a guy that definitely did not get laid much, you know, and a guy that was an alien amongst us.
Del Toro still hasn't gotten to make the Mountains of Madness adaptation he wanted to make and I wanted to see. But what's weird is, as I've grown older and become more interested in stories that are more compelling than Lovecraft's original works, it seems that Del Toro has as well. In a recent interview about The Shape of Water, he said, "This is the first time I speak as an adult about something that worries me as an adult. I speak about trust, otherness, sex, love, where we're going. These are not concerns that I had when I was 9 or 7. The Shape of Water doesn't have any elements that would be regarded as traditionally Lovecraftian by purists like Giles or the teenager I used to be, but its story gets at what I think makes Lovecraft actually work in the first place. Human stories about our alienation from each other and our lonelinesses, our victimization by forces beyond our control that see us as outside the norm, and how we can at least partially rectify this by learning to see the beauty in something previously seen as alien. In a sense, it's a story about the people of Innsmouth who happily chose to join with the Deep Ones, quite literally embracing otherness, raising children who literally learned to love to be different." Now, the film's perspectives and plot and texture make it not really invite much of a comparison with Lovecraft in a straightforward viewing, but maybe that's proof of how good it is. The Shape of Water has so successfully excavated all the garbage away from its spiritual predecessor that despite depicting something that directly happened in a story Del Toro has definitely read, the comparison still feels strange, wrong almost. This film captures the beautiful, human, mesmerizing center of Lovecraft's writing. It's the kind of story he could, or perhaps should, have been writing all along.
I actually quite like The Shape of Water, but this is one case where I think H. Bomber Guy is pretty far off the mark. I think actually in the case of The Shadow over Innsmouth, this is where the catharsis really comes into play. the deep one, quote unquote, the fish man in the shape of water, isn't a challenge to the corrupt, if you will, as Lovecraft might see it, ideals of a decadent, liberal, modern society. He is its validation. He is showing that even in the alien that has not been, that within the alien who has not been corrupted by the horrible state of human power in the modern world, we can find these attitudes and predilections that we associate with the true human, but ultimately as a result of our history and our socialization. So while I largely agree with the ethical attitude of The Shape of Water, it doesn't depict the alien. It uses instead the alien to deify the ethical assumptions of the director. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. But I think it misses the point to say that this is a story that Lovecraft would have written insofar as we are talking about Lovecraft. Because I think, crucially, what distinguishes the Fishman in The Shape of Water, I forget what his name actually is. I'm sorry if I'm calling him the Fishman and annoying people. It's been a little while since I've seen it. But the Fishman in The Shape of Water from a deep one is that the Fishman in the tank, when he's captured by this government agency, demonstrates through his gesticulations and his expressions an innocent curiosity. He does not know who it is who has captured him. He doesn't understand what they're doing. He lacks the means to communicate effectively, and his only goal appears to be his own freedom. The deep ones, by contrast, if you captured one in such a way, would look out at from the glass of his tank with mocking cruelty, knowing that someday the deep sea hordes are going to rise up from the shore and level the human sphere of existence. It would be mocking and cruel and vindictive, a sort of biological I told you so. The deep ones, I think, in The Shadow over Innsmouth, in fact, represent that mode that the reactionary goes into when they find themselves utterly beaten, utterly powerless, and faced with with aesthetic and ethical assumptions and norms that they can't absorb and can't live with. That is how they assert, that is the representation of the rage and the sort of fantastical future revenge against the arrogant contradictions implicit in the norms that are prevailing now. That was a really convoluted way of saying that. I think that, in essence, the deep ones, or the old ones, or the great old ones, or the evil flying space polyps, what have you, these are the declaration that you may win now, filthy liberals, but the world will prove you wrong in time, and your rule is short-lived. That kind of thing, you know? Whereas I think the deep one, the Fishman in The Shape of Water, he carries none of that animus against human society. He's indifferent in the sense that a child is indifferent. This is an alien world, but not an alien world that he fears, except for, of course, the sharp, pointy objects that they're using to contain him in the moment. He's like the blank canvas that is the interior of any human mind once you strip away all of its history and all of the little pressures that mold how human beings act in the world. There's kind of an intellectual purity about that creature that a Deep One doesn't have. A Deep One has a hostility towards things in the world that Lovecraft had a hostility towards. And of course, at the end of The Shadow over Innsmouth, the outcast, or at the very least alone protagonist, discovers that actually he is of a kind with the Deep Ones and goes to join them, and his perspective doesn't change. Now, we never actually see that world because, of course, they are the other, and you can't really write a point of view of something truly alien to the human, because at that point you have assimilated them to the human. But I don't think The Shape of Water is a story Lovecraft could have written, much less should have written, at least insofar as he remains Lovecraft. I think Lovecraft writing The Shape of Water is the death of Lovecraft. Now, maybe it's a good death or a merited one, but in any case.
For me, there's something personally wonderful about finally really coming to an understanding of a film that touched me in ways I didn't realize and that never really got much recognition. Right as a film that understands this just as well gets released and actually gets major recognition and even wins an Oscar.
I am an immigrant, unlike many, many of you. And in the last 25 years, I've been living in a country all of our own. Because I think that the greatest thing our art does and our industry does is to erase the lines in the sand. We should continue doing that when the world tells us to make them deeper.
While it's easy and correct to be dubious about the value of winning an Oscar, I do think the success of a film like this is a really hopeful sign for the future of how people see that which is alien to them. There's a philosopher named Julia Kristeva whose work was pretty formative for me. I discovered her through her being quoted in a series of critical essays on Lovecraft, one by Gina Whisker entitled Spawn of the Pit. The quote went,
"By recognizing our uncanny strangeness, we shall neither suffer from it nor enjoy it from the outside. The foreigner is within me, hence we are all foreigners. If I am a foreigner, then there are no foreigners."
Why?
If I am a foreigner, then there are no foreigners. Okay. I don't know. I find this sentence up here, our uncanny strangeness, a little bit suspect. Just because it does something very bizarre. It looks at the uniqueness and the individuality of separate human beings as if these are as if there are irreconcilable differences between rational beings, let's say. Our uncanny strangeness. And yet it dissolves it into a blanket description. We are all simply strange. Well, no. Maybe this is being pedantic, but the foreigner is within me, hence we are all foreigners. I don't know. This is just a weird sentence. I probably need context from the essay.
Why be alien to each other when we are all alien to ourselves? So, what have we learned about how to adapt Lovecraft? Well, I think there's a point here about how we have to decide what really makes his work good in the first place, what the core truths in his work are that ought to survive into a future they inspire. An adaptation, to me at least, only needs fidelity to what really matters about the text, and neglecting to bring across other aspects, like the finer points of its philosophy, or its particular linguistic flourishes, or certain characters, or even its racism or homophobia, isn't a failure to be fully faithful to the original work. It's demonstrating a successful understanding of why those stories were worth reading about in the first place in spite of those flaws. In focusing on a person's experiences and treatment for their sexuality, or on a relationship with someone seen by others as an alien outsider, these works explore the originals and their feelings of otherness better than Lovecraft did. You don't have to go find a copy of this 10-year-old obscure film if you don't want to. It's not perfect by any means, and lots of the criticism the film's received is valid. Even the director's commentary opens by admitting they aren't fully happy with the film.
There are 85 locations in this movie. Ridiculous.
It's certainly nowhere near as good as the best film ever, Gremlins 2. but it meant something to me and was very important to me in a formative period of my life, and sometimes that's kind of more important than the writing or execution. As I look out into the internet and find many other queer fans of Lovecraft's work, and writers in some form inspired by these feelings themselves, the wealth of literature exploring this side of his writing, and films taking up radically humanizing perspectives even towards that which might literally be considered monstrous, I can't help but feel that there's a side of Lovecraft's work the man himself died unable to fully comprehend. And in a way, that's fitting, isn't it?
But there's one other great story inspired at least partially by elements of Lovecraft, and I'm going to talk about it soon on my channel. Join me in the future when I reveal spectacularly why I filmed segments for this video at night in the woods. Oh, I just kind of gave it away then, didn't I?
Alright, so we've been going for 2 hours, admittedly partially because I seriously screwed up the audio, or at least my microphone screwed up the audio. Yeah, we'll blame the equipment. And I spent a long time speaking to nobody. But I'll actually give my thoughts on how best to adapt H.P. Lovecraft using modern film technology. I think what's often mistaken about the appeal of Lovecraft by filmmakers who try to do Lovecraftian horror or Lovecraftian stories is that they assume that the appeal of Lovecraft rests in any individual story. And maybe that was the case for people who read Lovecraft back when he wasn't an entity, when he was sort of an unknown, small fringe author of strange fiction and science fiction magazines. But I think the appeal of Lovecraft rests in the fact of a plurality of similarly themed stories, so that they all occupy, or they portray rather, a similar vantage point in a similar universe. And by reading Lovecraft stories, you don't really leave one universe and enter another when you switch from the Call of Cthulhu to the Shadow over Innsmouth, to the Shadow Out of Time, to Dreams in the Witch House, to Dagon, which is a really good entry point if you want to read a Lovecraft story. I think rather, it's actually sort of like Warhammer 40k or like Lord of the Rings, where you have this implicit, not so much implicit in these because it's made explicitly connected, but all of these stories together form a science fiction universe that is implicitly rich in a diversity of these fascinating elements that can all coexist. When you finish reading Solaris, that world is gone. When you switch from Solaris to Roadside Picnic, that's a different world. When you switch from Roadside Picnic to, I don't know, Annihilation or War of the Worlds or the Three Body Problem, you're exiting one world entirely, discarding that whole history sort of in your imagination and reopening the world with another one. With Lovecraft, by contrast, despite the fact that the protagonists of any given story have a very final end in the contexts of those stories, you, the reader, you can exist in a world in which all of these things are happening concurrently, or at the very least in the same world. That's why sort of the Cthulhu mythos has expanded far beyond Lovecraft's own writings, because he wrote them in an open-ended way such that all of these things are compatible with each other. The doom of mankind is projected into the future, a distant future or a near future, but a future that hasn't come yet, or into dreams, or our history is supplanted, of course, by the existence of older creatures that planted us here, or simply supersede us in greatness or awareness, or are simply so different that there's no point of comparison to say one is better than the other or more than the other in terms of their ultimate reality. But we can have multiple explanations for these entities that simply occupy, or not multiple different explanations, pardon. We can have like many different cases of these greater or different beings and simply have them dislocated in time or in space. So Cthulhu can absolutely live under the sea and predate mankind, and the deep ones can also predate mankind and be predated by Cthulhu. And these can all work in tandem. It's like Lord of the Rings. There's the elves in their history, the dwarves in their history, Mordor. Even Mordor has a boss, or a former boss, who's currently burning in whatever the Lord of the Rings equivalent of hell is. Gandalf was an angel in another life. There's these whole orders of things. Like, there's a richness to the world implied by the diversity of Lovecraft's fiction that sort of one-off science fiction lacks. So, ironically enough, I think to be true to Lovecraft, to the appeal of Lovecraft, actually isn't to accurately represent one specific Lovecraft story, but to do more or less exactly what something like Bloodborne did, where you have all of these things in their narrative form as elements of the environment that you pass through, because that's what the reader of a Lovecraft story does. You don't just read The Shadow over Innsmouth and that's your definitive reading of Lovecraft. You read The Shadow over Innsmouth, you're fascinated by it, and you read other stories that expand on elements of that story. Or that even just have a similar feel, like the world is a similar place. Wouldn't it follow from being an alien to oneself that all would necessarily appear alien to you? I don't know. What does it mean to appear alien to oneself? I mean, you have a conception of normalcy, presumably, like in the case of The Outsider, say, he looks in the mirror and is horrified at what he sees, and he recognizes it as ghoulish. He appears alien to himself precisely for the reason that the other people in the house that he has seen, by comparison, do not appear alien, they appear familiar. But yeah. So, I mean, I think the proper genre for a true Lovecraft story in a film or in a series would be actually the fantasy epic. I think it would be something like Lord of the Rings, where, like, in that scene where they're running through Moria on the stairs and the giant demonic figure is chasing them while these other lesser beings are firing arrows. That's a setting. That's a kind of drama that could incorporate the unique elements of Lovecraft's world building, without succumbing to the kind of trite finality that so much attempted cosmic horror falls into. I think actually, sort of to return to another sort of pseudo-Lovecraftian writer, this is one of the reasons why the Area X novels by Jeff Vandermeer are so effective. Less so as they go on, but the main thing is that he depicts this, I won't spoil it, but the story of the first one, in which this first crew goes into Area X, that sort of resolves, or more accurately, it trails off. But then the next story is in the same universe, doesn't culminate in the same way, it has a different character doing different things in a different setting. And you, the reader, are just passing through this fascinating world that he's created. It's much smaller than Lovecraft, of course, because it's only a trilogy of novels, and the reason why the last novel fails so terribly is that he does resolve things. And unfortunately, it's like, it's Conan Doyle syndrome, right? It's a man trying to write a satisfying conclusion to questions that are bigger than him. Or in the case, for those who don't know, Conan Doyle syndrome refers to, well, Arthur Conan Doyle attempting to write Sherlock Holmes, a man who is, by description, much smarter than Arthur Conan Doyle could have possibly been. It's the reason why Dr. Manhattan is so annoying in the Watchmen movie, because he makes elementary philosophical mistakes, but he's written as a god. He's not a smart man. He's a I guess Alan Moore is a smart man in some ways, but he's a non-genius's or a non-intellectual powerhouse's idea of what an intellectual powerhouse is. Which is not to say that I could necessarily recognize that either, but, you know, it's like, I thought Dr. Manhattan was stupid. But I digress. I think that the appropriate way to adopt Lovecraft in the 21st century is just to bite the bullet and make a multi-billion-dollar Warhammer 40k epic. There, I said it. But, yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry about the technical difficulties early in the stream. I think we'll get those sorted out for tomorrow. I think tomorrow night, at some point, I'm going to do the second half of this stream, just because we lost so much time with the lost audio. And we're going to go through the distributist's response to this video, which is going to be interesting because he, of course, also identifies as a reactionary. So I'm actually looking forward to... I haven't seen that in forever. I actually have no idea what my response to it is going to be. But we're going to try and take it as seriously as possible. I actually like the distributist's work when he's just giving his opinions on stuff that he's read, right? I don't agree with almost any of his opinions. I think he's generally not very well thought out, but when you're giving like your own candid point of view on something, that's worth paying attention to. Somebody is freely giving you insight into their perspective, and I think that's worth taking a look at. Diogenes asks, have you read Nick Land's essay Exterminator? I have not read any Nick Land. I have no immediate intentions to do so. I am going to be looking at reactionary writers in the relatively near future, because I wanted to get a better understanding of them and make some videos on my thoughts. But no, I haven't read Nick Land. I've read a decent amount of Moldbug, to my great regret. It was a painful experience. I haven't read, I guess, Dugan's Third Positionist. He's not, whatever the hell that means. He's not reactionary. But yeah, no, I haven't read Nick Land yet. And yeah. Oh, King Crocoduck, I didn't even see you there. Pleasure to have you. I swear to God, I feel like my YouTube career, quote unquote, is like a JoJo arc. I criticize somebody bitterly and then I end up really liking them in a short amount of time. So watch out for giant slabs of stone King Crocoduck. But in any case, thank you all very much for listening and suffering through this horrible, horrible technological catastrophe that was this stream. I think tomorrow will be a lot smoother. But oh, that's interesting. So Diogenes is expanding on this. Nick Land's essay Exterminator is on Lovecraft and the Fermi Paradox. I will have to read that then, won't I? Damn. Well done, you got me. Now I have to read Nick Land. Even though I don't want to. So many kooks, so little time. Alright, well, I had a very long night at the hospital yesterday, so I'm going to wrap it up here, and I will come back tomorrow for part 2, and we will look at the distributist's video on Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft, and why horror is reactionary, apparently. As always, thank you for listening, and take care.